The power of thought. There's a saying in the tradition of yoga that as you think, so you become. This is a piece of ancient wisdom that's been repeated and pops up again in many philosophies. The idea, of course, isn't that just, I think I'm an elephant and you become an elephant. It's not that simplistic. It's rather that the way that you think, the kind of thing you think about, will influence you and will stick and affect your personality. So if you're always thinking kind thoughts, you will tend to become a kind person. You'll begin to see the world that way. Or conversely, if you're always being critical and negative, that'll stick, that'll become part of your personality, and it's difficult to change. Now, there's a really neat saying that's come up in neuroscience, which is neurons that fire together wire together. What this is referring to is neural pathways. In the science of neuroplasticity, which is a fairly recent field of brain science, but a tremendously important one, they've noticed that this idea that as you think, so you become, is actually reflected in the physical brain. If we keep thinking in a particular way, it creates a new kind of a neural pathway where neurons actually join together and create these kind of default lines of thinking. So, this is one of the ways in which empirical science or scientific research has begun to validate some of these ancient ideas and intuitive understandings about the mind and the brain and how they work. So this is very important for us in terms of the power of thought, because what does it mean? It means that what we think has a lasting and deep impact, especially if we think it repeatedly. Now, one particular type of thought has, it's very kind of stuck in our minds, if you like, and that is beliefs. So if you believe in something, it's like a thought that's become somewhat fixed. Now, beliefs can change, but usually if you have a belief, especially if it's maybe a religious belief or a belief about yourself, what you're capable of, what you're not capable of, these tend to be hard to shift. And so they have a lot of power over us, if you like, or we can use them to give ourselves power over ourselves. So here's a story about that. That illustrates the power of belief. There was a child therapist working with a group of young children, and their problem was that they were old enough to be able to walk. They were between 1 and 2, somewhere a little more than 2. They should have been able to walk. There's nothing wrong with them physically. But they couldn't. They were crawling. They could stand and hold on to an object, but they hadn't cracked walking. And there seemed to be like a mental block preventing them from taking literally that next step, or that first step. And he was puzzling over this and working with some other therapists, and he came up with an idea for a game. So he got the group of kids, and he set up a couple of heavy objects, a couple big chairs, I think, and between them he strung a rope. And he got them to come and hold onto the rope, and supporting themselves on the rope, they could begin to take steps. They weren't walking without putting their weight on the rope, but they were actually moving across the room like this. And they loved this game because it was something new. And they started coming and taking turns. They go and keep coming back around. Each day he replaced the rope with a thinner rope, and then it became string, and then eventually it was just cotton, and they weren't actually leaning on it at all. They wouldn't support their weight. They were actually walking without realizing that they were walking, and that was the key. Because it seemed that somehow they had not been able to walk because they thought they couldn't. And he had tricked them into realizing that they could. And then he actually cut the cotton by now on each side, and they would just walk around holding the cotton because they associated being able to walk with holding the cotton. So I love this story, of course, and it really shows you how a self-limiting belief can prevent you from doing something that you're actually capable of. So I want you to ask yourself, have you ever found yourself blocking yourself or just not being able to do something because you couldn't, you thought you couldn't, and at some point realizing, oh, actually I can. There are lots of examples of this from sports especially, and many different fields. But you might have your own example. And then I want you to think, okay, would you have an experience of changing that belief, of overcoming that and freeing yourself of that? I for example, I have a little problem with technology. I'm actually not that bad at technology. It's just that I don't believe I am, and that's actually the issue. So I have this, a clock in my car. It tells the time, and in California, where I live, every 6 months they change the time from daylight saving to non-daylight saving and back and forth, 1 hour. And it took me 3 years to figure out how to change the time on the clock in my car. I thought I'd need to buy the only way to do this was to buy a new car, Finally, I figured it out. And what enabled me to do that was to actually try. And once I actually started fooling around with it and trying to fix it, it took me 30 seconds. I had been not trying because I thought that I couldn't do this fantastically challenging technological thing, which actually the kid in those pictures could probably do, simply because I thought that I couldn't do it. So we do this as much as anybody. So you might have your own example of that. So I want to look at thoughts and emotions. So thoughts, we can control them to some degree, that we can consciously say, okay, I'm going to think about, a goldfish. But sometimes it's hard. If you try not to think of a goldfish, that's more difficult at this point, you might notice. But we do kind of control the thoughts, and they define the goal of where our mind is going to go. Now, the way to learn how to stick to that goal is repetition. Practice, that's why the previous program on habits is very important. It's training, it's like the push-ups, right? You develop the mental muscle. But actually, once you've got your goal, what really takes you there and gives you the motivation is emotion. So there's this, can be a very harmonious relationship between thoughts and emotions. Emotions are like the engine of the car, and then the thoughts are the steering wheel. They're both important, right? If you don't have the steering wheel, it's dangerous. If you don't have the engine, it's useless. You're not going to go anywhere. So we need to create a kind of harmony between thoughts and emotions. And, this process is not magic, it's mind. It's about getting clear on what you want and making sure you want the right things. In other words, make sure you're pointed in the right direction before you put your foot on the accelerator of emotion. So you'll learn a lot about using thought to transform your world. You'll learn how to let go of painful memories and thoughts. That's a big one for many of us. How to sublimate desire, how to redirect desires that you find are pulling you in a direction you don't want to go. How to use thought to determine your life direction and the big picture kind of thinking. What to think about first thing in the morning. This, of course, refers back to the habits piece, but, morning habits and evening habits. What kind of last thoughts are good to have at night? Some people pray last thing or meditate before they go to sleep to help make sure they'll have peaceful sleep and that the world of dreams is something positive. And lastly, how to use thought to make yourself happier.